It's good to have the lively bunch this morning. This is on. Yeah, I guess that's what it is. I was fixing to say this is like my Wednesday night class with the kids, man. All right, it's good to have you this morning. Still not listening to me. Get no respect around here. No respect. I would say I get an elder up here to, quieten everybody down, but then I remember I am one. Okay. Now, I've got a weak voice, so I can't yell as loud as I could. So y'all have to listen up. All right, man. 2 Kings 5. We are in the story about Naaman. One of the most interesting stories. We covered it, the bulk of it last time we were together, but we've had a week in between, so I'm sure all of you have forgotten, but I'm not going to repeat it. I'm going to continue going forward. Naaman is that Syrian general that had leprosy, you remember, and one of his campaigns into Israel, he captured a young girl. We don't know how old she was, but she had some concern for Naaman, even though she had been captured and become a slave and a servant of Naaman's wife. And so she came to Naaman's wife and said, hey, why doesn't he consult the prophet who is in Israel who could heal him of his leprosy? And so whatever conversation took place between the wife and Naaman was convinced of, hey, there's hope for me. And so he went to the king of Israel first, and the king of Israel took it as an aside to him, an assault or a threat, asking him to heal him of his leprosy. And the king said, well, I'm not God. I can't do that. And finally, Elisha the prophet, evidently, I don't know if through a vision or something or rumor, sent word to the king and said, send Naaman to me. And so Naaman came with all kinds of gifts and, his entourage, and he arrives at the door, probably of the hut of Elisha. I'm sure Elisha's dwelling wasn't a palace or anything. And Elisha, and it's really interesting. You have to see Naaman is probably in his chariot at the front door of, Elisha. And you have to understand something about Naaman. He's identified as a noble warrior, all these great things about him that have been listed, yet he has leprosy. But, he's still a person of pride, and so he's there. And what does Elisha do? He sends his servant out to him. This is unacceptable. I mean, it's humiliating that a servant would come and speak to this great person of status and reputation of Syria. And the servant told Elisha's message to him to go dip 7 times in the Jordan River, and he would be cured of his leprosy. And so how did Naaman react to the message? He said, there's no way I'm going to do that. I mean, I thought is what the pivotal statement is. He had imagined or had assumed that probably based upon who he is and everything, that there would be a spectacle around his healing. Maybe that's something that happens in the pagan environment of where he is, that there's always these, rituals and various things that would be done for people. But he didn't receive any of that. He just was told what he needed to do, and that wasn't sufficient for him. At least it wasn't a word that met the stature of the man. Okay? Surely someone would come out and wave their arms and call upon the gods or whatever and cure him of his leprosy. So he turned around with everything and left. And then someone began to reason with him. If he told you to do some, great thing or, did all this, wouldn't you have, submitted to what he said? And Naaman, yeah, I would have, but how easy would it be to go to the Jordan River and just dip 7 times? I mean, do it. And so he went based upon, the rationale of those who were under him, and he dipped 7 times, and that 7th time he came up, and he was clean as a whistle. And so he came back. By the way, he came back. It's about 40 miles out of his way to come back to express gratitude to the prophet Elisha and to give gifts, and all that. Now, there are several things that we talked about the assumptions of Naaman. Number one was he thought probably he could purchase his healing because of all the, the clothes, the gold, the silver that he was bringing with him. And I think we discussed that somehow, I think that's how a lot of people think. You could buy or at least win your way to something good, a favor, and that just doesn't work with God. God's looking at the heart of the individual. And so he couldn't purchase it, and despite the fact he couldn't purchase it, he was also insulted because the people that he was expecting, some type of ceremony that would be, equal to the stature that he occupied, it didn't happen. And so there were lots of assumptions. And so that's why I like the idea. I used it all, I still use it today with, kids and everyone, It's the Naaman syndrome, I thought. I thought. How many people assume or they think or they have some presuppositions and expectations, and when those aren't met, then it gets the individual upset, But the simple truth is simple. Why can't individuals humble themselves and accept the simplicity of what's being told to them? Well, it's the Naaman syndrome, I thought. So as long as he thought and he was angry and he turned away, what did he still have? He still had his leprosy, So what I think and what I thought or my presuppositions doesn't matter. I still have my leprosy, my sin. How much easier is it then just to obey, just disobey, and see the blessing that's given to you? So when he obeyed, he came up and he's healed of his leprosy. So the story of Naaman's healing is great to illustrate the necessity, not only the necessity, but the blessing of obeying God. There wasn't anything hard about what Elisha had told his servant to do, to tell Naaman. It wasn't anything hard, dipping 7 times. But he was offended by the waters of the Jordan. He wanted to go to the clear waters, wherever you are, your lake, your river, your city's always the best compared to everybody else, And so he just assumed that, various things, but he still has leprosy. How much does it cost us if we disobey? It costs us everything, It doesn't remove the problem. So what stood in Naaman's way of not receiving the blessing before he finally obeyed? What was it about him that caused his negative reaction at first? His attitude, we would say probably his pride, His pride was hurt because all the expectations, all the presuppositions, even the money that he came to give the prophet, all of that was meaningless to the prophet and to God. What God is interested in is a contrite heart, a heart that's humble and repentant. And that's, I guess, we know that it's very difficult. It's difficult to humble ourselves. You say, no, it's not. Yeah. It's difficult to admit you're wrong, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know why that is about us, but human beings have a difficult time with that. That, to me, is why repentance is God's hardest commandment, because it requires on our part to admit that we're going the wrong way. If you've had a life going the wrong way, it's hard to admit that you've wasted, in a sense, that all that time, that you've been wrong with your goals and your outlook on life, and to change, it's a radical, transformation. But Naaman finally does it. And so now he's a great leader, a noble leader, a leader in Syria, and now he's cleansed of his leprosy. So he's received great blessings. Now, unfortunately, there's always some in the camp, God's camp, so to speak. And this is where I think the real lesson of Naaman and Gehazi, Elisha's servant, are put side by side. Who did Jesus have the most problem with? The insiders, the Jews, or the outsiders, the Gentiles? It's the insiders, wasn't it? It's the insiders. That's always a mystery, isn't it? Why? Why is it from within? Well, when we get to Gehazi, this is verse 15 of 2 Kings chapter 5. And these are the parallel. Remember, I've told it several times, I don't want you to forget, and I know I'm redundant in this, but the Bible likes setting characters side by side for you to make the judgment on which is showing the greater example, which is the example of obedience, virtue, or, the example to follow. Well, the example here even is the struggle of Naaman, okay? He refused at first, and finally he submitted. And people are like that sometimes. When you plant a seed, when you teach the gospel, you teach someone, it may take a while for a person to work through that pride of admitting, yeah, you're right. And when they come to that point in their attitude, then it's pretty easy to continue with gospel teaching of, confessing Jesus as Lord, being baptized, and all the things. They just kind of fall in place once someone has humbled themselves in the sight of the Lord. So, beginning in verse 15, we have, and these are some other things you'll also see of Naaman that I think are interesting. Then he returned, this is Naaman, to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him. Now, Naaman is traveling 40 miles out of the way. He's already left. He's dipped in the Jordan, now he's going back home, and now he turns back. And so he comes all this way to express what to the prophet? What? Gratitude. Hasn't that been the characteristic of what we've seen? And the people who have been blessed by God, healed, raised from the dead, or whatever, the first thing they do is to come to express gratitude to God. So this is exactly what Naaman does. And he came, and this time the Elisha the prophet came out, okay? And Naaman's meeting the prophet, it seems, for the very first time face to face. Prior to this, it was only his servant Gehazi. Okay, so he came and he stood before him and said, "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel." How hard do you think it was how hard was it for him to say something like this? He's grown up in paganism, in Syria, worshiping other gods, doing other rituals. And now he's come to learn about the true God of Israel. So accept now a personal present from your servant. He identifies himself as what? As a servant now to Elisha. What a radical change. If you want to see someone before they become believers in God and someone after, Naaman is an example of this. Don't forget his position in the army, how important he is to the king of Syria, who is expressing, this is almost like treason. you know, if you think about it. And so, verse 16 says, but he said, as the Lord lives before whom I stand, I'll receive none of this. So Elisha is saying, keep, you know, he's not accepting the gifts. He wants, you know, don't do it. And what do you suppose Elisha is doing that for? Why wouldn't he accept the gifts, or, you know? Do you think there's a bigger picture that he wants Naaman to understand? Yeah. Okay. Is the God's gift for his obedience to come, and maybe to keep himself out of it. You know, there's always the inclination for us to be mesmerized by individuals. The Corinthian church had that problem, you know. They gravitated to certain preachers, teachers that they liked. I of Cephas, I of Apollos, I of Paul. Then you had the standout, you know, I of Christ. You know, I always wonder about that. You know, maybe they're saying that kind of, you know, not in a good way, but, you know, just to set themselves apart from everybody else's. But anyway, you already have the beginnings, if it's not dealt with, of sectarianism, of different sects, which would lead to denominationalism. See, it's that Christ's body is on the verge of being divided in the Corinthian church, all because of personalities. You know, they say Paul, at least, you know, from extra biblical writings, and then from things that are also mentioned, and it may be they're mentioned in a sarcastic way, but Paul wasn't all that impressive as an individual, you know, but he was powerful in the Word. And there was just one of the accusations of some of the false apostles and stuff that, yeah, you know, he writes letters that are really, you know, powerful, but when you see him in person, it's like, who's this dude? You know? So there was that kind of attitude. Maybe he wasn't a person of big stature and foreboding, you know, a person that radiated certain things. Maybe he was just an ordinary individual that just had motivation, you know, because of what he knew and who he was following.
Yeah, people thought the same about Jesus.
Yeah. And the thing about it is, I know that we have movies and TV shows like The Chosen and other things. They're always going to paint Jesus in some kind of, I don't know, some persona that's has to do with presence. You know what I mean? Whether it's looks or, you know, big or tall, or, you know, he's always stands out some way. Whereas in Isaiah 53, in the prophecy about the Messiah, what did it say? What did Isaiah say about the Messiah, the suffering servant?
He had no form or comeliness or anything that would make us desire.
Yeah, there wasn't anything that would jerk the head of someone, you know, as they passed by. Who knows? Jesus may have been a small individual. Maybe he wasn't so tall. I don't know. But his appearance wasn't that radiated what individuals place value in. What radiated from Jesus was truth. His character. That, you know, was the attraction of who he was. Nothing of an external nature. So I think one of the reasons why, and this is speculation, we're not told really in the text, but it makes sense that Elisha refused the gift in order to demonstrate it's not him, it was God. You know, it was God who is the one who healed you. But there's also other things about Naaman that we'll read about here. Verse 17, the Naaman said, if not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth for from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or a sacrifice to any god but the Lord. What do you find interesting about that? This is Naaman talking. What's he want to take back to Syria? Because you got to understand, his understanding of God is not complete, right? So what does he want to do? Yeah, he wants to take dirt from Israel. Think about this.
The only God, only true God.
Yeah, and so when he worships or whatever, he wants to be on the dirt of Israel. Now this is an incomplete understanding of who God is, but you have to admire what he's thinking, what he's working with now, because he wants God in Syria, but he has this limited view that the gods. The way that the people in ancient days looked at deities is that deities had territories. Every region or empire or, city had their god that was territory. When you got out of the territory, then, you're out from under that god's protection. And that was the pagan view of gods and goddesses in many ways. They all had their, flag of the deity that was going to protect them. The deity had their territory. So it was always a fight against gods when there was war. Whose god was the superior god and all that. And we've seen that in Elisha when he defeated the prophets of Baal and, Mount Carmel and stuff. So God is showing himself to be the only God. And Naaman has come to understand this. He's the only God. It doesn't necessarily indicate that he dismisses the other gods. He just knows that the sovereign God is who? Yahweh, the God of Israel. But he wants to take this dirt, and I think it's symbolic. He wants to take God home with him, so to speak, okay? All right? Well, I think, as far as his incomplete knowledge of things, this is quite an ask and quite a venture for him. People are going to ask him, where's the dirt come from? Why are you doing this? He might be interrogated by others, but he wants to do this. Let's continue reading. Then he has this, in this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. And he said to him, go in peace. So what's he now concerned about, which is kind of interesting. As the right-hand man of the king, what is his obligations?
Well, that has to hold up the king.
Yeah,
go into the temple.
he's the protector of the king, and he's required to go in, and the king goes into worship, and the servant's there, and the servant, has to bow down and let the king do his worship stuff. But what is he conscious of? He's convicted of something.
Because he knows that I guess you say he met the one true God, and he knows who the true God is.
Right. So he's asking for forgiveness. Now, nothing in the text is saying that Elisha forgave him, or is offering forgiveness. He says, just go in peace. Sometimes people have used this as an argument to be involved in certain things that aren't right for the sake of evangelism. And I think that's a big stretch. Yeah. That's a big stretch. What we're seeing as far as Naaman's attitude is you're seeing a lot of things that are happening in the conversion of somebody. Okay? Think about it. I know that when people are converted and come to Christ, it doesn't mean they have a full knowledge of all things yet, do they? There's still things that they've got to confront about their own life. They've repented of what, things that they've learned, but then they got to work out their salvation. You know what I'm saying? Working out your salvation doesn't mean you work it according to your own will. I just work it out the way that I want to. Now, what that phrase means in the New Testament is one is applying God's truth to their life setting. You've got to You've got to work God's will in your life. And we don't know what ultimately happened to Naaman. I don't know if, he was dismissed, or someone learned about his conversion. He was executed. Maybe he came to Israel as a God-fearer, or I don't know all the ramifications. But what I do know is what the text is telling us, that there's a transformation happening in Naaman, and he realizes that there is an immediate issue that he has to confront, and he's not sure how to do it. So he's warning Elijah to know, may you pardon me, because of my position and where I am, I've got to do this. So what I like about the scenario here is seeing an individual who's struggling with their life setting and how to align it with God. That's good stuff. That's a good picture, I think, of someone going through the process of change. Remember, his whole life has been pagan. And so what does that tell us too? Maybe we need to be a little bit patient with people, because radical changes come, okay? People have to work through those. And, don't ask me for all the ramifications and stuff like that. I don't know. But what I am saying is, in regard to the conversion that happens, even in my own life, I continue to have to adjust in things that I learn, what's right, what I need to avoid. We all go through that process. And so here's the example of Naaman. Now, in following that, verse 19, he said, go in peace. And I find that interesting, because go in peace, he gives the shalom to Naaman. And shalom is a word that's very important among Jews. The Old Testament. What's shalom mean? It means peace, but it's more than that. Shalom is theological. It's a wish for peace of mind, peace, internally, prosperity, well-being. It has a broad meaning to it. Okay, that's why it's a greeting among the Jews, shalom, but it's deeper. It's deeper theological than our, how are you, or hi. That to me is not theological. It has no depth to it, right? It's just sort of an interpersonal statement that we said. But the Jews had shalom, which had a deep meaning to it. Now it became a cliche, shalom, shalom, but it has roots in wishing the well-being to people. It's almost equal to, may God be with you. So he sends him, go in peace. But when Naaman had gone from him a short distance, Gehazi's, you got to think about it for a minute. Gehazi's sort of wheels in his head are starting to turn a little bit. He's starting to think about things. He's going to be upset that Elisha didn't receive the gifts. So for whatever reason, he's going to tell you what's going on in his mind, at least the text is. He says, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, see, my master has spared this Naaman the Syrian. I like the language here. It kind of almost sounds a little bit sarcastic, the way that it's written. This Syrian. Doesn't sound very nice, does it? It's not very nice in the Hebrew either. This Syrian. He says, and not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. So how does he justify it? He even justifies it religiously, as the Lord lives. Now you have a parallel in the book of James where it says, come on, let's enter into such and such city, the book of James, and let us engage in business and make a profit. And then James says, well, you need to remember that your life is like a vapor that appears for a little while and then what? Vanishes away. You should say, if the Lord wills, we will go to such and such city, engage in business and make a profit. James's emphasis is for us to bear in mind that God is a part of all of our decisions. He's a vital part in the decisions we make, even business decisions. Okay? Now, Gehazi is using the language of religion to justify his actions here, which is what some do in religion. This happens a lot when we take a verse out of context and we make it say something, that sounds right by using a Bible verse, but it's not. There's lots of verses in the Bible that can be ripped, out of context and sound, as if God's given us, motivation or the purpose of doing certain things. So, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. You take that out of context, well, that becomes a religious argument for lots of things, even things that would be foolish, but we're using it as if it is a religious justification on the pursuit of this particular thing. So it's always, I don't know, if you had some studies in church history, it's always the twisting of the Bible to justify certain things that people really want to have or to do. And that always gets in trouble because even the example of Gehazi. So he's upset that this Syrian was healed, but nothing was taken from him. The gifts were not received by Elisha. So he says, as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. So Gehazi followed Naaman, and when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from his chariot to meet him and said, is it all well? And he said, all is well. My master has sent me to say. Now what is he doing? Okay, this person has just invoked a religious phrase, as the Lord lives, and then he lies. How can you live with that dichotomy? The Bible talks about, saying one thing on one side of your mouth, completely opposite on the other side of the mouth. So it shows you how easy it is for people to be hypocritical. I mean, it's very easy to, use religion to justify, and you're lying over here, but you don't see the error. Maybe he does know the error, but, the text continues to talk about him, but it's almost like it comes naturally, and perhaps maybe what he wants has so clouded his judgment that he has no restraint. So let's continue. So he runs after him, and he says, my master sent me to say, they have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim, 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. Maybe there has been some prophets. We're not told all the background, but we know that the sons of the prophets, that's an active group, during this period of Elijah and Elisha. But we're not told that the master said anything about this, and I'm assuming that he didn't because of the refusal of the gifts. And Naaman said, be pleased to accept 2 talents. You reckon that he knew that Naaman would give the gifts? He was willing to give them beforehand, so why not now? So he's taking advantage of Naaman now. And he urged him and tied up 2 talents of silver and 2 bags with 2 changes of clothing and laid them on 2 of his servants, and they carried them before Gehazi. So Naaman is sitting some servants, and they're going to take these gifts back to Elisha. Now, I got a question for you. How is Gehazi going to justify himself before Elisha? Now, hasn't he been hanging around Elisha a long time? He has, hasn't he? Does he not know that Elisha is the prophet of God? He knows. He's been around. He's been a servant. Usually the servant, Elisha being the mentor, Gehazi might have been the up-and-coming individual. I don't know. That's what Elisha was to Elijah, his servant. And so I don't know what's going through his mind, but isn't it funny when you're, well, I wouldn't say funny, but isn't it odd, ironic, that this individual seems to have, he's living in a false world right now. He thinks that he's going to be able to fool Elisha, that he's getting this and it's going to be for himself. He's lied, which he doesn't believe he's going to be found out. It's the perfect plan in his mind, and he's living in an illusion, which actually is what sin is. It's living in a false world, and it's an illusion. That's what people say about us and serving God. A lot of critics and atheists and things of that nature, they point us, and we, our heads are so high in the clouds, and all we think about this eternal life stuff and Jesus and the truth. The truth of the matter is, they're the ones living in the false world. And so Gehazi, I don't know. He's some people would admire his courage. Would you call this courage?
Call it greed.
Stupidity? I mean, there's other names for it, right? Well, some people mistake courage for stupidity or stupidity for courage, But Gehazi, so he gets these and he's coming home. They're carrying these items. Now, we mentioned last time the change of clothing is important back in those days because, usually people only had one robe, one tunic, that's it. They wore it all the time. So to have something to change, something new, would be a great blessing. And when he came to the hill, he took them from their hand. Notice what he's doing. They carry the stuff for him on these horses and stuff. He gets close enough to his dwelling, where Elisha is. Then he gets all the stuff, he tells them to go. So he's aware, but he thinks that his plan is secure. And so you have to love the prophet's response. And then he came to the hill, took it from him, and he went, I lost my place here, their land and put them in the house, and he sent the men away, and they departed. He went in and stood before his master. Now, I want you to notice the structural link. Okay, you remember I always say structure is interpretation. It's the 3rd time where we have the word stood. Right? Naaman stood before the door, the prophet. Then Naaman stood before the prophet. And now Gehazi is what? Standing before his master. So what does all that mean? Well, Naaman stood and he was humbled. And he came back and stood and was grateful, right? And now Gehazi, he's standing before his master, but he's standing how? What? Yeah, he's standing, as a dishonest person. At least Naaman didn't have dishonesty in his heart, doesn't look like. I mean, he came to Elisha with everything that, he knew to be true, gifts and his stature. He came, and he is who he is, but Gehazi is not. He's a facade now. He's got a,
Being deceitful.
Yeah, he's being deceitful. So he's standing before the master. And the master is Elisha, and Elisha represents who? God. It's the same kind of thing in Acts chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira. They thought they got away with it, didn't they? They sold a piece of property. Everybody was selling things and giving the proceeds to the apostles to disperse among the people who had remained in Jerusalem, who came from distant places, on that feast day. And then they were converted and they wouldn't go home because they were enjoying the fellowship, this Christianity. And so there became a need for people, and people were in Jerusalem. Christians were selling things to provide for their brothers and sisters, this new kingdom, this church. Well, Ananias and Sapphira saw all this, and right before them, you remember who sold property and laid it at the apostles' feet? Who is he? Barnabas. He's noted in Scripture. He was called a good man and everything. So he did that, and he came and he brought it. And then the next thing, you have Barnabas, then you got Ananias and Sapphira. And so they sell. Nothing wrong with that. That's what everybody's been doing. But they kept back a portion of the proceeds. Then they came and brought what was remaining to the apostles. Well, there's nothing about keeping part of the proceeds and then bringing what's left to the apostles, but they made it appear what? That this was everything, that they didn't keep back. They were given everything. And so Peter says, why are you lying to the Holy Spirit? And Ananias what? Drops dead. They come and they bury him, and as soon as the people who buried Ananias come back, I can't remember what, it was like a couple hours or something like that. They came back, and then, the wife, Sapphira, comes in, and Peter says, is this what, y'all did? And Sapphira says, yes, that's what we did. She dies, and the people that just got back had to get Sapphira and take her and bury her next to her husband. What a legacy, right? Lying to God. You're making it seem something that isn't true. Deceit. They could have, not said that, hey, we kept a portion, whatever, but, use this. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't make it appear that you're doing something that is not really true.
That was also a pride thing.
Yeah.
They wanted that reward.
The recognition, perhaps, that maybe even Barnabas received and others. Yes.
Well, I think the comparison is good to help us understand why Elisha was saying go in peace. Because it's difficult to understand why would he say that. And you were talking about, you have to work out your own salvation. Well, if your heart's not right, what difference does it make what your actions are?
Yeah.
Your heart has to be
Right.
He's saying love God.
Yeah.
He could have quoted the first commandment to him.
Yeah.
You shall bow down to another. But he's basically saying love God with all your heart.
Yeah.
And if your heart's right, then your actions.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what I'm thinking. The sincerity of Naaman, I'm sure there are things that he wrestled with and tried to correct, because it's been emphasized that he is a believer in God. I guess it's time up. I'm sorry about that. It went fast. At least to me. It may not have to you, but